Hello there, fellow night owls, early birds, and anyone currently existing in that mysterious in-between time. Welcome to tonight's slightly less gentle waltz back in time. I'm so glad you've joined me for another journey into the past, where we'll be exploring the long, winding, and frankly, often bonkers path that led to the ultimate downfall of one of the greatest empires the world has ever known, the Roman Empire. Before we dive into the juicy details of imperial screw-ups and barbarian bashings, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and, more importantly, what time of day it is for you right now. Are you snuggled up in bed, desperately trying to avoid doing laundry, or perhaps you're just looking for a bit of calm, or chaotic depending on my mood, relaxation during your waking hours? Either way, I'm honoured to be your slightly unhinged guide on this historical rollercoaster. Feel free to drop a comment and let me know. If you enjoy immersive, mostly relaxing storytelling that combines fascinating history with my questionable comedic timing, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. We'll be exploring many more captivating tales from our shared past in future episodes, but for now, let's gently, or perhaps not so gently, turn our attention to ancient Rome. Close your eyes and imagine yourself transported back in time over 2,000 years ago. Picture the bustling streets of Rome at the height of its power and glory. The grand marble temples and monuments gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, probably blinding a few pigeons. The forum buzzing with the chatter of politicians, who were probably just gossiping, merchants trying to upsell you on a toga, and ordinary citizens going about their daily lives. Mighty legions, looking like they stepped straight out of a really expensive movie, marching out from the city gates, destined to expand the empire to the farthest corners of the known world. They were the original trendsetters in military might, with their highly disciplined formations and those snazzy red cloaks that just screamed, "We mean business, and we look good doing it." It must have seemed in those golden years that Rome would endure forever, that its wealth, its power, and its sheer, indomitable spirit could never be broken. Spoiler alert, they were wrong. Like that one friend who insists they can eat an entire pizza by themselves and then regrets it halfway through. Even the mightiest of empires can fall. And Rome, my friends, was no exception. This wasn't some sudden, dramatic implosion, like a poorly constructed building in a slapstick comedy. Oh no, Rome's decline was a slow burn epic, a historical train wreck that took centuries to fully unfold. The story of Rome's downfall is a long and complex one, spanning centuries of wars, political intrigues, think Game of Thrones but with more togas and less dragons, economic upheavals and seismic social and religious shifts. There was no single cause, no one fatal blow, but rather a slow unravelling, like a cheap sweater, as cracks formed in the very foundations of Roman power and prestige. It was a compounding series of bad decisions, unfortunate events, and emperors who probably shouldn't have been in charge of a lemonade stand, let alone a vast empire. Over the next few hours, don't worry, I'll try to keep you awake, we'll calmly meander through the winding history of Rome's decline, pausing to examine some of the key moments and figures that shaped its destiny. We'll meet emperors both wise and foolish, mostly foolish, let's be honest, generals both valiant and vainglory, the ones who got cool statues, and a vibrant cast of everyday Romans living through extraordinary and often inconvenient times. So, make yourself comfortable, take a slow, deep breath, and let the modern world and your overdue bills fade away as we embark on our journey back through the mists of time to explore the twilight years of the once indomitable Roman Empire. Our story begins in the closing years of the 2nd century AD. On the surface, the empire appeared to be at the peak of its strength and stability. The frontiers were secure, the economy was thriving, and a series of wise and capable rulers known as the 5 Good Emperors had ushered in an era of peace and prosperity. This period, from Nerva to Marcus Aurelius, was truly a golden age, a time when Rome actually seemed to have its act together. It was basically the Roman Empire's equivalent of a really good hair day, with everything falling perfectly into place. But beneath this veneer of invincibility, cracks were beginning to show in the foundations of Roman power. These hairline fractures would eventually spider and spread until the once solid bedrock of the empire crumbled away entirely, much like my self-control around a plate of cookies. The seeds of decline were sown subtly, often in the very successes that Rome enjoyed. Its vastness made it difficult to govern, its wealth attracted envious eyes, and its military prowess ironically made its leaders complacent. One of the earliest warning signs was a slow but steady erosion of the authority and competence of the imperial office itself. For generations, the empire had been guided by a succession of rulers who embodied the sober discipline and civic-minded virtue that had long been held up as quintessentially Roman ideals. Think Stoic philosophers, not TikTok influencers. They were men who understood the weight of their responsibilities, who prioritized the well-being of the state over their personal whims. But as the 2nd century drew to a close, a new breed of emperor began to ascend the throne. Men more interested in the trappings and pleasures of power than in the arduous work of governance. Basically, they were in it for the perks, not the paperwork. And boy, did those perks look good on Instagram, if they had it back then. One of the most notorious of these new rulers was Commodus, son and heir of the revered philosopher-king Marcus Aurelius. Commodus came to power in 177 AD at the tender age of just 19. Now, while his father had been a paragon of wisdom and duty, Commodus was a vain and capricious youth who cared more for the adulation of the mob than for the weighty responsibilities of empire. He literally fancied himself a gladiator, and would frequently descend into the arena to fight against terrified opponents who had been, instructed to submit to the emperor's blows. He was basically the Roman equivalent of a trust fund kid who thinks he's a professional athlete because he bought a fancy uniform. He even renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, basically Commodusville, and even rechristened the months of the year after his own various titles and honorifics. Imagine having a month named Glorious Leader McCawsome Pants. Yeah, the Roman Senate, bless their hearts, probably just nodded nervously and hoped he'd eventually get bored and take up macrame. As Commodus indulged his whims and neglected the work of government, the once solid foundations of imperial authority began to crack and erode. The Senate, which had long served as a check on the excesses of emperors, found itself increasingly sidelined and ignored. Its members, once powerful voices in Roman politics, were reduced to little more than clapping seals, endorsing whatever bizarre decree their emperor dreamed up. The military, sensing the weakness at the heart of the empire, began to assert its own prerogatives. Soldiers, seeing their supreme commander prancing around in a lion's skin, probably started wondering if they were fighting for an empire or a circus. In 192 AD, after more than a decade of misrule, Commodus was finally assassinated in a palace coup. His death, however, did little to restore stability or integrity to the imperial office. If anything, it opened the floodgates for even more chaos. In the coming years, Rome would be racked by a series of short-lived, often violently deposed emperors as various factions within the military and the Senate vied for control. This wasn't just a revolving door, it was a spinning death trap of power grabs. This cycle of assassination and turnover reached a fever pitch with the rise of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguard. Originally created to protect the emperor, from, bad breath or a stubbed toe, the Praetorians soon became a king-making force unto themselves, installing and removing rulers almost at will in exchange for bribes and political favours. It was basically a very deadly, very expensive game of musical thrones, where the loser often ended up with a dagger in their back. In the span of just 16 years, from 235 to 251 AD, no fewer than 20 emperors claimed the throne, many only for a matter of months before being dispatched by their own guards or by rival claimants. 20 emperors. That's more leadership changes than a particularly disorganized startup. The once inviolable dignity of the imperial office had been reduced to little more than a hollow crown to be bought, bartered, or seized by force. Imagine your boss being fired and replaced 20 times in 16 years. Your head would spin faster than a Roman chariot on a downhill slope, and you'd probably just give up trying to remember names. But the rot afflicting Rome in these years was not confined to the imperial palace alone. Even as the political foundations of the empire were fracturing, its economic underpinnings were beginning to crumble as well. For centuries, Rome's wealth and power had been sustained by a robust system of agriculture, trade, and tribute from conquered provinces. It was a well-oiled machine, bringing in resources from across the vast Mediterranean. But, as the 3rd century AD dawned, this once vibrant economy was showing signs of strain. In the countryside, centuries of intensive cultivation had begun to exhaust the fertility of the soil, leading to declining crop yields and the slow abandonment of once productive farms. It's hard to keep an empire fed when your topsoil is taking a permanent vacation. In the cities, the debasement of the silver currency by a succession of cash-strapped emperors led to rampant inflation and a loss of confidence in the money supply. Basically, your Roman dollar was worth less and less, making your daily bread suddenly cost a small fortune. Imagine trying to buy groceries with monopoly money. That's what it felt like for many Romans. And on the empire's frontiers, the unceasing pressure of hostile tribes and rival powers was forcing Rome to pour ever greater resources into maintaining its borders, resources that might otherwise have been invested in shoring up the economy at home. The military budget was eating everything, leaving little for roads, aqueducts, or, keeping the populace happy. These mounting economic woes only added to the sense of drift and decay that was gradually pervading every corner of Roman society. The grand facade of the empire might still have looked imposing from afar. The legions still marched, the monuments still gleamed, but up close the cracks in the foundation were becoming harder and harder to ignore. It was like putting a fresh coat of paint on a house that's about to collapse, all while the termites are having a field day in the basement. It would be a mistake, of course, to imagine that these cracks appeared all at once, or that their full implications were immediately apparent to those living through these troubled times. The decline of Rome was a slow and subtle process, unfolding across generations. Many Romans, no doubt, carried on with their daily lives much as they always had, tending to their trades and their families, celebrating festivals and mourning losses, largely insulated from the great currents of history shifting beneath their feet. They were probably more concerned with whether their local baker had fresh bread than with the subtle erosion of imperial authority. But with the benefit of hindsight, we can see the seeds of Rome's ultimate downfall being planted in these years of creeping dysfunction and doubt. The once unshakable edifice of Roman power was already growing brittle, even as the empire continued to expand its frontiers and assert its might on the world stage. In the coming hours, we'll see how these early fault lines would widen into yawning chasms as the Roman world was rocked by fresh waves of invasions, insurrections, and internecine strife. We'll meet the emperors and usurpers, saints and barbarians, who would shape Rome's destiny in its final centuries. But as we explore these turbulent times together, I invite you to hold in your mind the image of Rome at its height, the Rome of Augustus and Trajan, of Cicero and Virgil, the Rome that built roads and aqueducts that still endure to this day, that gave us systems of law and governance that still shape our world in profound and subtle ways. That Rome, the eternal city on the 7 hills, the Caput Mundi, the centre of the world, can seem impossibly remote to us now, separated from our modern reality by an unfathomable gulf of years. But in the flickering light of our historical imagination, we can still catch glimpses of its faded glory. So, as we gently drift through these next chapters in Rome's long decline, let us pay our respects to the monumental achievement that was the Roman Empire, and to the fragile, fallible individuals who lived and struggled within its vast embrace, not so very different from you or me. With that in mind, let us slip softly into the rich and dreamlike realm of Rome's past, and immerse ourselves in the captivating story of its decline as the first cracks begin to spread through the mighty foundations of empire. I'll be right here, my voice a soothing, or perhaps sarcastically amused, constant, guiding you through the complex web of characters and events. There's no need to strain to remember every detail. Simply let the story wash over you, and allow your mind to paint its own vivid pictures of this vanished world. And if at any time you feel your eyelids growing heavy, or your thoughts beginning to wander, know that it's all right to let yourself drift off into gentle sleep. The story will be here waiting for you when you return. So close your eyes now, take a slow, deep breath and let the world of ancient Rome materialize around you. Picture the marble columns and triumphal arches, the golden eagles on scarlet standards snapping in the wind. Hear the distant tread of legionary boots, the laughter and chatter of the forum crowds, the metal-on-metal clang of gladiators sparring in the arena, hopefully not Commodus. And as the scene sets itself and the journey begins, know that you're in good company, for we are all, in our own way, heirs to the legacy of Rome, both its triumphs and its tragedies, its wisdom and its folly. In exploring this vanished empire's rise and fall, we are, in a sense, exploring the very roots of our own civilization, the deep and tangled taproot from which so much of our modern world has grown. It's a legacy that we carry with us, consciously or not, in the very language we speak, the laws we obey, the roads we travel, the stories we tell. A legacy so vast and so enduring that it can be difficult at times to perceive its full scope and grandeur. But tonight, as we embark together on this journey through Rome's fading twilight, we have a chance to step back and marvel at the sheer sweep and drama of this civilization's arc, to feel the weight and heft of all those centuries pressing down upon us, even as they lift us up on the wings of wonder. So let us begin, you and I, here at the hinge of Rome's fortunes, with the empire still clad in the raiment of its power, but with the first threads already beginning to fray. The journey will be long and winding, strewn with the wreckage of war and the glinting gold of glory. But I promise you, by the time we reach its end, we will have seen the soul of a civilization laid bare in all its splendor and all its sorrow. Content warning. This script contains a brief, non-graphic reference to violence. As the crisis of the 3rd century finally began to recede, and a battered Rome caught its breath under the reign of Diocletian, new threats loomed on the horizon. Diocletian, bless his organizational heart, tried to fix things by splitting the empire into 2 halves, east and west, thinking 2 emperors were better than one at managing this unruly beast. Spoiler alert, it mostly just meant twice the opportunities for sibling rivalry and civil war down the line. Still, for a brief period, he brought some much-needed stability. But Rome's sheer size and wealth had long attracted envious eyes from the tribes and confederations who lived in the lands beyond the Danube and Rhine. Groups like the Goths, Vandals, Saxons and Franks had clashed with Rome for centuries. Roman armies would frequently cross the frontier to pacify and subjugate these so-called barbarians, either incorporating them into the empire or using them as a buffer against even more distant foes. But now the tables were starting to turn. The barbarians weren't just a nuisance, they were becoming a legitimate threat, like a really persistent doorstep salesman who eventually just walks into your house. As we've seen, the upheavals of the 3rd century had left the Roman military severely weakened and depleted. Legions that had once seemed invincible now struggled to repel increasingly bold raids and incursions by Germanic warriors. Slowly but surely the military balance of power was shifting. Barbarian warbands were evolving into powerful tribal kingdoms with sophisticated political structures and capable leaders. They looked upon Rome's weakening grip on its frontier provinces and sensed an opportunity. It was like seeing a going-out-of-business sale at your favourite rival store. But instead of half-off togas, it was entire provinces. As the 4th century AD dawned, one tribe in particular would emerge as the Romans' most formidable adversary, the Goths. They were an East Germanic people who had migrated from southern Scandinavia to the region north of the Black Sea in the early 1st millennium AD. For nearly a century, the Goths had been a familiar presence along the lower Danube, sometimes fighting the Romans as enemies, other times serving the emperors as allies. They were like that frenemy you just can't quit. In the early 300s, the Goths divided into 2 distinct branches, the Visigoths in the west and Ostrogoths in the east. Their rise to power would be spurred by a looming menace from the steppes of Central Asia, the Huns. The Huns were a nomadic people whose origins and ethnic makeup are still clouded in mystery. What's clear is that their westward push in the late 300s set off a chain reaction that would shake an already wobbly Roman world to its core. Think of it as a historical domino effect, where each falling tribe pushed another, until the biggest domino of all, Rome, was in the crosshairs. Fleeing the Hunnic advance, the Visigoths sought permission to cross the Danube frontier and settle inside the empire. In a decision that would have momentous consequences, the Emperor Valens agreed, allowing the tribe to establish itself in the Balkans in 376. It was a move born of expediency, not friendship. Valens hoped the Goths could serve as a first line of defence against the Huns, while also providing a handy pool of recruits for the perennially short-handed legions. Think of it as Rome trying to get a 2-for-1 deal on defence and labour, but forgetting to read the fine print. But any illusions of an easy alliance were swiftly shattered. Once across the river, the Goths were subjected to brutal mistreatment by the local Roman authorities. Corrupt officials exploited them, charging exorbitant prices for food and even selling their children into slavery. This was less welcome wagon and more highway robbery. Desperate for food and angered by their shabby welcome, the tribe rose in rebellion. In 378, the crisis came to a head at the fateful Battle of Adrianople. Leading a massive army, Emperor Valens confidently marched out to crush the Gothic upstarts. But in the parched plains near the city, the Romans blundered into a catastrophic defeat. Trapped and surrounded by the Gothic cavalry, the imperial army was massacred. Valens himself was killed in the slaughter, becoming the first emperor to fall in battle against a barbarian foe. It was like the ultimate hold my beer moment gone horribly wrong, leaving the Eastern Roman Empire in utter disarray. The shock waves from Adrianople reverberated across the empire. The Eastern Roman army had been gutted, leaving the Goths free to roam and plunder the Balkan provinces at will. It was a grim sign of things to come. More tribes now rushed to exploit Rome's vulnerability. On the last day of 406, a massive force of Alans, Vandals, and Suebi poured across the Rhine, overwhelming the Roman defences like a great wave. This wasn't just a border skirmish. It was a complete and utter collapse of the frontier. The Germanic invaders now crashed over Gaul, Hispania, and other once secure provinces. The unthinkable suddenly seemed possible. After centuries of keeping the barbarians at bay, the frontiers had completely collapsed. Lands that had been Roman for 500 years or more now fell under the sway of Germanic kings and warlords. The Goths, meanwhile, went from triumph to triumph. After years of drifting across the Balkan provinces, they were now led by a capable young king named Alaric, a shrewd tactician with Roman military training. Alaric dreamed of winning a permanent homeland for his people. In 408, the Visigoths invaded Italy itself, the sacred heart of the empire. After 2 grueling sieges, Alaric's army stood at the gates of Rome. The Senate, which had once commanded kings and decided the fates of nations, was reduced to sending a pathetic plea for mercy. The mighty city would be spared, the envoys promised, if Alaric would accept their pitiful bribe of gold, silver, silk, scarlet cloth, and pepper. According to the historian Zosimus, Alaric roared with laughter at this offer, quipping, "The thicker the hay, the easier it is mowed." He demanded a far greater ransom, and the Romans had no choice but to pay. It was basically the world's most expensive protection racket, and Rome was paying dearly for its past glories. But it was only a temporary reprieve. In 410, the Visigoths returned. This time the gates were flung open by rebellious slaves, and Rome fell to its attackers. Alaric's army poured into the capital, burning and looting as they went. For the first time in nearly 800 years, Rome had been conquered by a foreign enemy. The shock was profound, prompting much anguished reflection among the empire's elites. "It is my prayer, dearest son," wrote St. Jerome in the aftermath, "that you may live among these things as a pilgrim, a sojourner, a citizen of Jerusalem, not of Babylon. Our tears are dried by the thought that God has spared us to warn others." Though the city itself still stood, the fall of Rome marked a crucial turning point. In a world where civilizations were thought to rise and fall according to the whims of the gods, it was seen by many as a sign of divine abandonment, a punishment for the empire's sins. The Visigothic sack was far from the last indignity the beleaguered Romans would face. In 429, The Vandals, under their king Genseric, invaded North Africa, wrenching the Diocese of Africa from imperial control. It was a devastating strategic loss. North Africa, with its rich agricultural lands, had long been the breadbasket of the Western Empire. Its vital grain shipments fed the swelling populace of Rome and other cities. With that province gone, the imperial heartland faced crippling food shortages. Imagine your main grocery supplier suddenly deciding they're going rogue. The loss of Africa also meant the loss of the lucrative taxes and revenues that had flowed from the region into the imperial treasury. Already reeling from the depredations of the invaders, Rome's economy entered freefall. With its finances in ruins, fields gone, and borders under siege, the Western Empire's position grew increasingly untenable. The Vandals' conquest of Carthage in 439 marked the de facto end of Roman rule in North Africa. Its shattered remnants would limp on for 3 decades more, but the West was now careening toward oblivion. As the 5th century AD reached its midpoint, the Western throne had become a grim game of musical chairs. A rapid succession of emperors tried and failed to stem the empire's bleeding. Most reigned for only a few years, if that, constantly looking over their shoulders for the next ambitious general or barbarian warlord. In 475, a general named Orestes seized control of the court at Ravenna and named his young son, Romulus, as emperor. The child ruler would be mockingly dubbed Romulus Augustulus, Little Augustus. In a twist of historical irony, the last emperor of Rome bore the names of both the city's mythical founder and the man who had inaugurated the imperial age. Little did young Romulus know that he would also be the one to close that chapter. His reign would be brief, more of a poignant footnote than a real attempt to resurrect Western imperial glory. He was essentially a historical cameo, appearing just long enough for the final credits to roll. In 476, Orestes refused demands from his barbarian mercenaries for land in Italy. Their response was swift and decisive. The Germanic general Odoacer defeated and killed Orestes in battle, then marched on Ravenna. There they found the teenage Emperor Romulus trembling in his palace. In a final indignity, Odoacer stripped the imperial insignia from the boy ruler and bundled him off to a comfortable exile in Campania. The Western Roman Empire had breathed its last. Apparently, even conquerors have a soft spot for kids. Or maybe he just thought, why bother with this kid? He's clearly not cut out for this. With that anticlimactic act, the long, turbulent history of the Western Roman Empire shuddered to a halt. Odoacer now proclaimed himself King of Italy, ruling the peninsula on behalf of his patron, the Eastern Emperor Zeno. Of course, the story of Rome was far from over. The Eastern Empire, increasingly regarded as the Byzantine Empire, would endure for nearly 1,000 years more until falling to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. And the ideal of a universal European empire, inaugurated by Augustus so many centuries before, would continue to transfix kings and conquerors for generations to come. But the dream of a unified Roman Empire, a single state encompassing the full scope of the Mediterranean world, had perished. Rome, the eternal city on the 7 hills, would pass into the realm of wistful legend, a hazy memory of past glories, forever pined after, but never again attained. And so, in this quiet hour, we ponder the long and winding path that led the Romans to their final destination. In telling the tale of their decline and fall, what lessons might we discern for our own civilization? Perhaps above all, Rome offers a cautionary tale about the dangers of imperial hubris. At the height of its power, Rome's dominion had seemed eternal and unshakable. The empire's sheer size and scope allowed its rulers to grow complacent, blind to the cracks emerging in the very foundations of their society. They failed to reckon with the tectonic forces that gnawed at the roots of Roman power, the crisis of legitimacy that ate away at the imperial office, the widening gulf between rich and poor, the slow rot of civic virtue and martial prowess. They thought their system was foolproof, but history as always proved them wrong. In their arrogance, they assumed that the barbarian tribes would always remain quarrelsome inferiors, awed by the splendor of Rome and content with their place in its shadow. They failed to imagine that the societies on their periphery might one day eclipse them in strength and supplant them as masters of the world. For centuries, Rome thrived on relentless conquest and expansion, always seeking to push its frontiers further out. But in time, that sprawling frontier became a source of weakness, not strength, an impossible expanse to patrol and defend. It was like endlessly adding rooms to a house without bothering to reinforce the foundation. And yet, even as Rome receded from history's main stage, its legacy would endure. It lived on in the splendor of Constantinople, in the soaring architecture of medieval cathedrals, in the Latin that would remain Europe's lingua franca of learning and statecraft. It shaped the art, philosophy, and institutions that would form the bedrock of Western civilization. The heirs of Rome may have turned to new gods and spoken new tongues, but they continued to draw guidance and inspiration from the old empire's faded triumphs. Even the Renaissance, that great reawakening of art and knowledge, saw itself as the rebirth of a classical ideal that had never truly perished. Rome's influence wasn't just a footnote, it was the entire prologue for much of European history. So rest now, dear friends, and ponder the long, completed journey of a civilization that once seemed eternal. In the morning's light, its monuments will still stand in mute testament to the heights that humanity can ascend, and its cracked and weathered ruins will whisper of the dangers of taking such glories for granted, and the ephemeral nature of even the mightiest works of mortal hands. The Goths had delivered a crippling blow at Adrianople, but they were just one of many tribes massing along Rome's borders. The Vandals, Saxons, and Franks, names that would soon be seared into the Roman psyche and possibly give Roman parents nightmares, were also growing restless, probing for weaknesses in the empire's defences. These Germanic tribes had long been thorns in Rome's side. For centuries, the Romans had tried to pacify them with a carrot-and-stick approach, sometimes trading with them, other times fighting to push them back beyond the Rhine and Danube rivers. But like a rising tide, the pressure from these tribes kept building, and the overstretched Roman legions simply couldn't be everywhere at once. It was like trying to plug 100 leaks with only 10 fingers, while simultaneously trying to herd cats. It didn't help matters that Rome was distracted by threats on other fronts. In the east, the Persian-Sasanian Empire remained a constant adversary, forcing Rome to split its military might. The Sasanians were no pushovers. They were a formidable empire in their own right, constantly vying for control of the lucrative trade routes and border territories. This meant Rome couldn't just focus on its European frontiers. It had a powerful rival snapping at its heels in the Middle East. And in the late 300s AD, a fierce new power burst onto the scene from the steppes of Central Asia. The Huns. These fearsome nomadic warriors, known for their superb horsemanship and deadly accuracy with the composite bow, began pushing westward, displacing other tribes in their wake. The Huns didn't directly attack Rome at first, but their migrations set off a domino effect, forcing more and more Germanic peoples up against Rome's borders. The rising pressure finally burst the dam in 406 AD. That bitterly cold winter, the Rhine River froze over, and when spring came, the ice breakup destroyed Roman fortifications along the riverbank. Tens of thousands of Germanic tribesmen, Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, poured across the Rhine en masse, fanning out across the Roman province of Gaul. This wasn't just a border skirmish. It was a complete and utter collapse of the frontier, a permanent breach in the Roman defences. The Germanic invaders now crashed over Gaul, Hispania, and other once secure provinces. The unthinkable suddenly seemed possible. After centuries of keeping the barbarians at bay, the frontiers had completely collapsed. Lands that had been Roman for 500 years or more now fell under the sway of Germanic kings and warlords. The writing was on the wall, carved in very large, very angry letters. More dominoes soon fell. In 410, the unthinkable happened. The Visigoths, led by their cunning King Alaric, laid siege to Rome itself. For the first time in nearly 800 years, barbarians breached the walls of the mighty capital. The sack of Rome sent shockwaves through the empire and marked a grim psychological turning point. If Rome wasn't safe, nowhere was. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a spiritual wound, a blow to the very idea of Rome's invincibility. But the Eternal City's humiliation was just beginning. In 455, the Vandals, who had carved out a kingdom in North Africa, came calling. Led by their fearsome king Genseric, the Vandals stormed ashore at Ostia and spent 2 weeks methodically stripping Rome of its riches. Priceless jewels, gold and silver plate, even the gilded bronze tiles from the Temple of Jupiter. All of it was carted away to adorn Genseric's palaces in Carthage. The term vandalism stems from the memory of their pitiless plundering. So, next time you see a graffiti tag, remember you're witnessing a small tribute to Genseric's legacy, just with less gold and fewer temples involved. The Vandals' conquest of North Africa was especially devastating to the Western Empire. For centuries, the fertile plains of modern-day Tunisia and Algeria had served as the breadbasket for Rome's teeming masses. The region supplied vital grain shipments that kept the capital fed and content. With that territory lost and the shipping lanes under Vandal control, Rome struggled to fill its granaries. Hunger joined fear as the constant companions of the once proud Romans. It's hard to maintain an empire when your citizens are grumbling about empty stomachs. Beset by external invasions and internal chaos, Rome's authority crumbled in a piecemeal fashion. Gaul was divided between the Franks, Burgundians, and Visigoths. The Angles, Saxons, and Jutes carved up Britain. The Vandals ruled North Africa. The Western emperors clung to Italy, but their position grew ever more precarious. The loss of so much territory meant a steep decline in revenue from taxes, money the empire desperately needed to pay its soldiers and fund its operations. In an effort to make ends meet, Roman mints debased the currency, cutting the silver content of coins. But this only triggered crippling inflation, further eroding public confidence. With its economy in shambles, borders overrun, and the mirage of invincibility irreparably shattered, the Western Roman Empire was a hollowed-out husk of its former self. By the late 400s AD, all it would take was one final gust of wind to topple this creaking relic. And that breeze was already blowing in from the east, ruffling the golden banners of the Huns as their most famous leader set his sights on Rome. His name still evokes dread even today, Attila, the Scourge of God. Born into a ruling clan of the Huns, Attila rose to power in the early 400s alongside his brother, Bleda. For a time, the siblings shared the kingship, extracting a fortune in tribute from a weakened Eastern Roman Empire. But Attila wasn't content to share power or wealth. In 445, he murdered his brother and assumed sole command of the Hunnic war machine. This guy clearly didn't believe in power sharing. Now the undisputed lord of the steppes, Attila launched a series of blistering raids and conquests that pushed the boundaries of his empire from the Caspian Sea all the way to the Rhine. A skilled commander and a master of psychological warfare, Attila used terror as a weapon. The speed and savagery of his attacks left a trail of dread in his wake. Where Attila has passed, it was said, the grass never grows again. Which, honestly, is a pretty good marketing slogan for a conqueror, albeit a terrifying one. In 452, this horde of nomadic cavalry, maybe 500,000 strong, rolled across the Alps and poured into Italy on a collision course with Rome. As Attila laid waste to the Po Valley, the Western Emperor Valentinian III could only watch helplessly from his refuge in Ravenna. With his Vandal foes controlling the seas and his borders stripped of legions, Valentinian was powerless to stop the Huns' advance. But fate intervened at the gates of Rome. According to legend, Pope Leo I himself met Attila and persuaded him to spare the city. The more likely reason for Attila's retreat was an outbreak of disease within his army and trouble stirring on his eastern frontiers. Whatever the cause, the Huns withdrew, but not before Attila extracted a promise of marriage to Valentinian's sister, Honoria, and a hefty dowry. It seems the mighty Roman emperor had been reduced to paying off a barbarian king. Awkward family dinner, anyone? So, Honoria, how's that marriage to the guy who almost sacked Rome working out? Attila didn't have long to savour his triumph. In 453, shortly after adding another young bride to his harem, the Hunnic ruler suffered a fatal nosebleed on his wedding night. He choked to death in a stupor, an ignoble end for a man who had been the terror of empires. With Attila's death, the Hunnic threat quickly receded. His sons squabbled over the succession, and the Hun's vassals asserted their independence, splintering the tribal confederation. But by this point, the damage to Rome was already done. The Western Empire was a rump state, its emperor a figurehead, its once proud army a patchwork of barbarian mercenaries. The last emperor to rule the West, fittingly enough, was named Romulus Augustulus, echoing both the founder of Rome and the first Roman emperor. But the similarities ended there. Romulus Augustulus was little more than a puppet ruler, a pawn in the power struggles of barbarian warlords. His father, Orestes, a former secretary to Attila, had seized control of the imperial government in 475 AD. To appease his barbarian troops, Orestes promised them land grants in Italy. But the Western Empire had precious little land left to give. It was like offering a slice of a pizza that's already mostly eaten. When Orestes reneged on his pledge, the simmering anger boiled over into open revolt. The Germanic mercenaries rallied behind one of their own, a chieftain named Odoacer. In 476, Odoacer's forces captured and executed Orestes, then marched on Ravenna. There, they found the teenage Emperor Romulus trembling in his palace. In a final indignity, Odoacer stripped the imperial insignia from the boy ruler and bundled him off to a comfortable exile in Campania. The Western Roman Empire had breathed its last. Apparently even conquerors have a soft spot for kids. Or maybe he just thought, why bother with this kid? He's clearly not cut out for this. A nice villa in Campania sounds much more his speed. The fall sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean world. The Eastern Roman Empire, the half of the empire that had long looked down on their Latin cousins, now stood alone against the tide of history. In a symbolic move, the Eastern Emperor Zeno abolished the title of Western Emperor, proclaiming himself sole ruler of a united Roman world, even as that world crumbled around him. He was effectively saying, "Look, I'll take all the credit, even for the part that just fell apart." Yet, in a strange twist, even the barbarians who had brought down the Western Empire seemed to respect the majesty of Rome. Many of them continued to mint coins bearing the emperor's likenesses and rule in the emperor's names, even if that rule was but a pale shadow of imperial glory. The light of Rome, it seemed, could not be fully extinguished. The empire left a deep and lasting imprint on the European mind. Its language, Latin, remained the tongue of learning and liturgy for centuries. Its legal code laid the foundation for civil law across the continent. Its literature, philosophy, and art set standards that endured for a millennium and more. Even the city of Rome itself, ravaged and depopulated, cloaked itself in the mystique of past glory, becoming a ghostly reminder of a bygone era. As Europe descended into the Dark Ages, scholars and chroniclers looked back with awe and longing at the vanished splendor of the eternal city. In time, a Western Roman emperor would arise again, this time wearing the crown of a Germanic monarchy that traced its roots to the conquests of Charlemagne. The Holy Roman Empire, as it came to be known, was a conscious attempt to resurrect the glories of Rome, even if it was, as Voltaire quipped, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. For 1,000 years and more, Rome's shadow stretched long across the west, even as the east carried the torch in the form of the Byzantine Empire, centered on Constantine's glittering capital of Constantinople. The Byzantines, who defiantly called themselves Romans, preserved the art, literature, and statecraft of Greco-Roman civilization for centuries, clinging to their Roman identity with fierce pride. They were the ultimate Roman superfans, keeping the flame alive long after the western half had flickered out. So, there you have it, folks, the long, glorious, and ultimately hilarious story of how Rome managed to trip over its own 2 feet. What was your favourite moment of imperial absurdity? Let me know in the comments.